The Story of Havarian, Part the First. Havarian meets Renard. Listen, and I will tell you a tale of how a man becomes a hero. Editor's note. This is not the revered saga known simply as Havarian, the 8-hour epic poem enacted by highly trained performers, so-called hand dancers, who declaim and, on occasion, sing, and who have been entertaining at High Hanath gatherings for generations. This is a modern translation of a much older work, the original text on which the saga was based. The language of this antique text is archaic Hanath, over 1,500 years old, and it is not always easy to translate, no simple matter to capture the tone and feeling of any given scene. Thus it invites comparisons to the better-known work, a recognized masterpiece. Those accustomed to the saga may find they feel the absence of the poetry, the artistry of the performers. Others may feel that this is closer to the true story. Listen, and I will tell you a tale of how a man becomes a hero. Of course, High Lord Havarian had noticed the slave Renard. It was hard to ignore him. He seemed to be everywhere. The first time he became aware of his existence was when the group, host and guests, came back from riding together, and one of the horses almost trampled a small, rather dirty child. Another slave, one of the stable boys, moved quickly enough to push the boy aside, but not fast enough to avoid entirely the horse's head, as the great beast tossed his ears in irritation and snapped his fangs at the retreating infant. Horse skulls are heavy and hard. The slave went down like a puppet with the strings cut, stunned, flattened by the blow. Looking down from his own mount, Havarian watched in deep concern. Was he dead? The horse that had knocked him down pushed the unconscious man quite gently, wondering, as they all were, if he had killed him, blew puffs of air into his face, and made clicking and purring noises. It took a few seconds, but his first movement was, remarkably enough, a slight smile, just for a second. Then those pale grey eyes opened, and his hands went to the bridle. He clicked and whirred his tongue, and the horse pulled back and upwards, literally hauling the slave to his feet. He cuddled and stroked the horse, shakily reassuring him, then turned to stagger away and throw up in the gutter of the horse-yard. He'd absorbed quite a smack. At the very least, he would have a spectacular headache. Havarian turned to his host, asked quietly, "Should we summon a doctor?" Jovan looked sideways at him. Even dressed for riding, the master of the estate seemed somehow more sleek than Havarian, more polished, harder, more decadent, as cold and glassy as the frozen river they had crossed. His large almond eyes were half-lidded, and he sneered a little at the suggestion. For a slave? For a horse-boy? He gave a dry laugh, then tugged on the reins of his horse. "Enough waiting. Let's move." The other boys were quick to usher them towards the dismount blocks in front of the stable, and Havarian looked over his shoulder at the injured stable boy. A woman, the child's mother perhaps, was thanking him, trying to touch him, to put her arms around him. The dazed man shook his head, put up the palms of his hands. "Don't touch me," the gesture gently said. Havarian wondered why, for perhaps all of a second. Then he forgot all about it. He didn't see the man that evening as Jovan entertained his guests with food and music and women. The women were beautiful, barely dressed, smiling, willing. They poured drink into your cup, into your mouth if you would permit it, fed delicacies to the guests, stroked their hair, their bare thighs, and smiled, glassy-eyed. Havarian, though he had brought attendants of his own, had allowed himself to be dressed by the house slaves. His hair was down, curled and oiled, a river of black silk down his broad back. His upper body was mostly bare except for the jewellery they had draped across him, along with the gold paint they had used to ornament his face and chest. His feet were bare, and his privates were covered with a golden cloth that reminded him uncomfortably of an infant's training garment. Jovan, similarly dressed, greeted him with pleasure, happy to see these concessions to the traditions of his house. The gathering rooms were full of cloying fumes, ill-lit, and heated to the point where they all sweated, even in those scant clothes. Havarian eventually overcame his disquiet, drank more than he should, took a little comfort in those smiling women, and almost forgot how unpleasant he found the heat, the loud exotic music, and the smoky incense. 2 of the women were in his bed when he woke, and they faded like ghosts, pale and a little unsteady on their feet. His attendants, Cressa and Eli, second sons of minor lords from his home region, were asleep in the adjoining room with companions of their own. They had taken even more wine than he had, and were still snoring. Havarian watched the women leave, steal quietly away before the men awoke. In the light of morning they looked ill and less smiling, less happy, though they bowed and addressed him with every courtesy as they crept out. Havarian pushed back his hair in a loose knot, quickly donned some of his own clothes, his boots, and went in search of fresh air. He swallowed half a pitcher of water before heading out, down through the kitchens into the stone square that backed the main building and led to the stables. Then he really saw him, for the second time. This time he was training with the son of the household. Bram, Havarian recalled. The boy's name was Bram, a surly adolescent, tall and long-limbed, but without the strength of a man. They were using wooden swords and daggers. Havarian remembered well how, long ago, he had bridled at being handed what he considered a child's toy instead of a real weapon. But it seemed that Bran was struggling to support even that weight, and the length of the sword was still a cause for bafflement and clumsiness. The stable boy was clearly a well-trained swordsman, highly skilled, gifted even. Havarian, biting into a fresh butter roll that he had helped himself to in the kitchen, took the time to stop and watch, to look at him properly. Shorter than any High Hanath, peasant stock, perhaps from one of the hill tribes. Judging by the clothes he wore, especially the hand-made lace-up shoes, well-made, tough but pliable, good dancing shoes. He was a strong, lithe man in his early 20s, perhaps a little younger than Havarian, with a comely face and a permanent expression of sad, silent defeat. His mane of hair was multicoloured and looked like it had never been cut, rarely washed, more like a wolf pelt than a head of hair. Havarian recalled reading about this. In that tribe, the heads of the infants, especially the boys, were treated with dyes taken from berries, flowers, and roots. When the hair grew in, it came with the colours that had been used on the child's scalp, a permanent change that lasted until they died. Havarian frowned a little. He had heard that the tribe was gone, wiped out by another marauding tribe that had invaded their lands from further north, years ago. He was surprised to see a living example of what his teachers would have called a filthy savage. He was indeed filthy, probably slept in the stables with the horses. Havarian realized now that he had been the lead rider when they went out yesterday, generally acknowledged as the strongest and most capable of their guides. He was young to be treated with such regard by the other men. Havarian had seen him from the back, but never his face, had heard his name, but could not recall it. The slave fended off the young noble's attack with silent patience, nodding when something impressed him, shaking his head a little when the boy was awkward and ungainly. Eventually the boy wrong-footed himself, and the trainer, with the gentlest of pushes, tripped him across his own sword, leaving him sprawled on the stones of the courtyard. The young lord scrambled to his feet, spitting fury, yelling insults at his instructor as he rained blows on him with his sword. Amongst the rest of the noise, Havarian heard him hiss, "What does my father's cock taste like?" The slave did not react, but calmly put him down again and again, without hurting him overmuch. Eventually the boy was screaming in frustration, and only stopped when he felt a dagger across his throat. A wooden dagger, to be sure, but still a killing move, and the end of the fight. He froze and looked at the stable boy as if he would like to tear him apart. His teacher shook his head slightly and said softly, "Anger does not help." Then he backed away and watched as the heir to the household threw down his wooden sword and dagger and spat at him before storming away, still raging. He picked up the weapons patiently, rose to find himself facing one of his master's guests. Clothed now, but stinking of last night, the too-scented smoke, the wine, the oil in his hair and on his body. There was even a design in painted gold still on his cheek. He was a head taller than Renard, and pale from the excesses of the evening. The slave waited for him to speak, while Havarian did the same. It was customary for a servant to nod, say softly, "My lord," in acknowledgment of his status. This man did none of that. He held the training weapons and kept silent. Finally, smiling a little, Havarian said, "Who taught you to fight?" The other man flicked a glance at his face as he said, "My father." A rich voice, not too deep, the kind one likes to hear in drunken song. And again there was no honorific. The light grey eyes, with dark eyelashes as long as those of the horses, dropped away from him again. Havarian smiled to himself. "What's your name?" He answered quietly, "Renard," without looking up again. Again no acknowledgement of Havarian's status. Yes, of course, he had heard the name yesterday. Renard. Unusual. Made him think again of the hill tribes. "Renard," he said gently. Renard nodded, silent, and now Havarian was trying not to laugh. Such unspeakable rudeness. Was he angry for some reason? Angry enough that he wished to offend High Lord Havarian? "Look at me." The grey eyes raised and met his softly. Havarian had already begun to say, "Your master does not teach you to say 'my lord' when you answer a question." Havarian shook his head dumbly. Yet another infraction. "No?" A further slight shake of the head. "He likes me silent." Havarian stopped then, finally recognizing the carefully guarded look in Renard's eyes. Misery. Silent, patient, accepting misery. Misery that does not expect its lot to improve. He dropped his eyes without permission, and Havarian was relieved. "Carry on," he said quietly, and watched the man go. The first time Renard saved his life was on the following day. Havarian had foolishly encouraged his horse, against the better judgment of the animal, to walk into an area of soft marsh, and the pair of them sank at a frightening rate. Havarian was soon soaked with soft, icy cold mud, and the horse beneath him was thrashing in panic. Cressa and Eli, his attendants and childhood friends, stood at the edge of the marsh, white-faced, not knowing what to do. Havarian had almost accepted that he would die today, when he saw Renard, summoned from the front, running lightly towards them, straight into the marsh. He stopped when his feet began to sink, and looked around, pulling from his waistband a short curved dagger that looked more like a huge claw than any kind of metal. He cut foliage, enormous leaves that were growing beside the path, and flattened them on the ground between them, gesturing impatiently to the others to do the same. Havarian could see that the leaves spread his weight and stopped him sinking as he crawled on his belly, stroked the horse's snout, whispering, clicking and purring, till the horse became still. They stopped sinking then, and Renard thrust out his hand for Havarian to take. For once Havarian did not even notice the breach of courtesy. He grasped Renard's strong hand and pulled, allowed himself to be dragged, to climb over the prone slave, and reach other, stronger arms. Before they whisked him away to get clean and dry, he turned back for a moment to see Renard comforting the doomed horse. The bath had taken the chill from his bones, and he was beginning to feel his fingers again, but he was not inclined to attend the evening gathering. It simply was not to his taste. Too much wine and the disturbing smiling faces of the drugged women, whose only purpose was to attend to the comfort of the guests. It was all a bit sickening. He was settling down to sleep when he finally asked the question, "What became of Renard?" His two attendants smiled at each other. Cressa informed him, "He refused to leave, stayed behind." Havarian looked at him in puzzlement, and Cressa continued, "He went back for the horse. Went to his own horse to fetch something. We all thought he was leaving with us. Then he went back for the horse." They shook their heads, marvelled at such behaviour. Havarian hesitated, then said, "And?" Eli clapped his hands, nodded, said, "Yes." He grinned, much impressed. The horse had survived. Coaxed by Renard to be still, dragged out by ropes that the stable boy had attached to the saddle of his own mount, soaking himself from head to foot in freezing mud in the process. But he had saved the horse. A day of wonders. Havarian slept deeply, dreamlessly. It was almost midday before Havarian awoke completely, and finding himself unattended, pulled on his own clothes to go in search of food. Cressa, Eli, and the other guests were helping themselves at huge tables of the richest offerings, making Havarian's stomach groan for the simplicity of bread and cheese. He did not recognize everything on his plate, but much of it seemed good. He was perhaps a little startled when Jovan strode up to him, his hand on the back of Renard's neck, forcing him to stumble along until, released, he fell at Havarian's feet. He looked different. His hair and clothes were clean. He smelled of sandalwood like the deep bath his friends had prepared when they brought him back from the ride. Havarian looked up at Jovan, surprised at the man's rictus of a smile. He was furious about something, and Havarian somehow felt an accusation was imminent. "The boy tells me he spent the night in your rooms." It was a growl through gritted teeth. Havarian looked at him in bewilderment. "My rooms?" He was shaking his head when Cressa began, "Well—" Jovan lost even the pretense of a smile and said, "Did you enjoy him? Did he please you?" He looked like he might explode. Havarian said, "Forgive me, Lord Jovan. I slept alone last night." He looked down at Renard, kneeling, his head hanging, silently waiting, patient, beyond hope. He went on, "This man saved my life in the marsh. I would be glad of an opportunity to thank him. My friends brought me back to bathe and sleep. That is all I know of yesterday." Jovan grimaced at him, doubting but unwilling to call him a liar. Cressa piped up, "My lord, we came across him at the back entrance to the kitchen. He had brought the horse back and cleaned it, but he was still covered in mud and shaking from the cold. His lips were blue. He was eating a plate of cold beans, leftovers from the kitchen. Eating, he did not add, with a metal spoon from a dented metal plate. No slave in Havarian's household would ever be treated so meanly." When no one spoke, Cressa went on, "We persuaded him to come back to the rooms." He laughed. "Not that he came easily. A brave little soul, but not a trusting one. We gave him a warm drink. Your bathwater was still warm, and we bathed him, asked a servant to clean his clothes. Chauvin's scowl made him quickly add, "When I say we bathed him, we helped him climb in, then left him to soak in the warm water." Chauvin's hostile glare was now turned fully on the two attendants. Cressa was talking rather faster than usual, almost as if he were nervous. "That hair was nigh impossible to get dry. We almost ran out of hot stones and towels, and it was the small hours before we finished. He was asleep 2 minutes after we rolled him into bed." Chauvin's face was thunderous, but his voice was soft. "Which bed?" Cressa smiled winningly. "Oh, my lord, we would not take advantage of him after he had saved my lord Havarian's life. He slept in my bed, and the two of us shared the other." After a few moments he saw the rage starting to fade from the host's face, and added, "My lord Havarian never knew he was there." Chauvin took his time to calm a little. Then he hissed to Renard, stunned. The younger man rose, his head still bowed. Havarian said unwisely, "He looks a lot better, clean." Chauvin stared. Eventually he said, "Since he pleases you, he can be your cup-bearer today." He looked down at Renard, who nodded his obedience, though his face showed confusion. He knew nothing of how to behave in the communal rooms. He was a creature of the stable and the fields. He knew riding and hunting, nothing about what happened in the salon when there were guests. The major domo came across with a jug of wine and pushed it into Renard's hands, gave rapid whispered instructions. For the next hour he stood, almost invisible, at Havarian's side, carefully pouring wine whenever the lord held up his glass. Havarian made another mistake when he helped himself to some unfamiliar fruit. Half of them were strange to him, including some dark purple berries that smelled inviting, but he was reluctant to put them into his own mouth. He called across Renard, wagging his fingers to summon him. He shook his head when the cleaned-up horseboy offered him more wine, smiled and said cheerfully, "Open your mouth." The colour drained from Renard's face, but he complied at once, working to keep his lips away from Havarian's fingers as he pushed 2 of the berries between his teeth. "What is this, some fruit we don't have in the south?" Renard bit down, allowing his mouth to fill with juice. Havarian was pleased and surprised when the grey eyes flicked up at him, and Renard actually smiled. A shy smile that he tried to suppress, but the sweetness in his mouth didn't permit it. He touched his lips with his fingertips and smiled again. Eventually he said, "Gojan berries from the far north." Havarian smiled warmly at him, fed Renard another berry, then slipped one into his own mouth, nodded in pleasure when he tasted the sweet juice. He said softly, "You saved my life in the marsh, Renard. I thank you. I shall not forget it." Renard, unused to hearing his name spoken by a Hanath lord, who had not been thanked for any service in almost a decade, nodded and gave him another tight, cautious smile as he ate the berry. Havarian said, "I hear you went back for the horse. Saved the horse. That was brave. A little heroic, I think. Certainly a huge risk for you to take." Renard gave a small shrug, said shyly, "I helped birth him. I could not leave him to die alone." From the silent Renard this seemed a long speech, and Havarian smiled and rewarded him by feeding him the last gojan berry. Again that wary smile, his fingertips to his lips, the nod of thanks. He was backing away when a movement attracted his gaze, and he saw Chauvin watching him from across the hall. The smile disappeared completely from his face. He seemed frozen, anticipating Chauvin's anger. The host jerked his head, and another slave took the wine flagon from Renard. Then his massive hand was back on Renard's neck, holding him, bowing him, forcing him to submit. Jovan turned to his perplexed guest and smiled, the gracious host. "I am gratified that you find my servant so pleasing. I know that you hope to travel in the north across the uncharted territories, if you can find a guide. This slave would be perfect for that. Perhaps I should sell him to you." He put his lips to Renard's ear and said, "Strip." Again no hesitation. 2 or 3 ties quickly loosened, and Renard was standing naked but for his shoes and a soft cloth that passed between his legs and tied low on each hip. Jovan was passing a hand across his chest and belly, inviting his guests to admire his property. Beautiful, no? It was indeed a fine body, toned by work and exercise, but Havarian could not understand why he was being invited to admire it. Jovan stared a challenge at him, while he tried not to look at the expression in Renard's eyes. "This is why I keep him to myself." He slapped the slave's naked midriff, throwing another hard, meaningful look at Havarian. Oh. Understanding dawned, finally. Oh. The stable boy was a sexual favourite of the host, who wanted everyone to know that he was for his own exclusive use. Havarian's heart swelled with pity for the man. Jovan went on, his voice full of scorn. "If only he wasn't such a natural little hero. You saw in the marsh. Not enough to rescue you, dangerous enough, but then he must risk all to save the damned horse." Havarian said smoothly, "I am very glad he did. I owe him a debt of gratitude. He saved my life, and it was I who put the horse at risk with my stupidity. He saved me from the shaming consequences of my own foolishness." Jovan snorted. "My problem is that he cannot be trusted to protect my property." He used his grip on Renard's neck to turn him, held the man's face hard against his shoulder, displaying his back to the guests. 3 parallel scars, once very deep, now dark indents, that ran across from one shoulder to his opposite hip. It had been a fine back before some animal had ripped it open. Jovan squeezed, forcing the slightest of huffing noises from Renard. He put himself in the way of an angry targ. More heroics, and no care for the damage done to this body, which is my property, mine. He turned Renard again, pushed his head forward so that he bowed, put one large hand on the man's hip, and pulled him sharply towards him in a grotesquely obscene gesture. Then he laughed, saying he did not care how it would ruin my view. He muttered, "Piece of filth," and pushed Renard away from him. Then, "Pick up your clothes and get out." Renard picked up his tunic, nodded his obedience to Jovan, then walked gracefully away. Though his head was bowed, his back was straight. Some of the guests were amused, but there were others, like Havarian and his entourage, who were shocked at the needless cruelty of this display. At last Havarian broke the silence and asked, who was he protecting from the targ? Jovan sneered as he waved his glass for another drink, laughed, said airily, "Oh, that was me." The next 2 days were eventful, and Havarian spent too much of his time listening wearily to the gossip of the other guests, many of whom knew Jovan well, and wishing he had not committed himself to such a long stay. He ached to be back in his own home, away from the host's casual brutality. Cressa and Eli, who moved more freely and who delighted in gossip, brought him news almost hourly. The dirty child that Renard had rescued had finally managed to fall under the paws of one of the horses, killed outright. Nothing the animal could have prevented, no malice involved. but the child was just as dead as if there had been. The weeping mother had thrown her arms around Renard, who unwisely returned the embrace to comfort her. It was a level of fraternization that he was not permitted, and when challenged, he admitted his fault at once. His fault, his punishment, he insisted when Jovan raged at him. So he was beaten, she was spared, while he was thrashed. Eli told Havarian, "Now we understand why the kitchen women were so loath to clean his clothes for us. They're not allowed to go anywhere near him." The other guests swapped tales of Jovan's mad possessiveness whenever the host was absent. They spoke at length of how beautiful the stable hand had been as a boy of perhaps 12, the lone survivor of a battle between two tribes. The invaders had wiped out his family, leaving him the last one standing. Havarian remembered the way Renard handled the wooden sword. His father had taught him, he said. Then there was the tale of a guest who did not heed Jovan's warnings, and their host strode into the guest room to find him naked and doing his best to mount an exhausted Renard. Jovan used his ceremonial dagger to give the man a deep cut on his bare backside, and informed the unfortunate guest's attendants that he would be leaving that night. No, he would not wait until dawn. He was leaving now. Wolves and targs be damned. He was no longer welcome. Then he turned his rage on the downed boy, berating him for not defending his master's property, by which he meant the boy's own body. When he pulled him up and saw the bruises on Renard's face, the closed, blackened eye, the split and bleeding lip. Mollified, he shook him and said, "Get back to the stables." There was no need to discuss it further. Each day there was some new horror. One morning there was an appalled and terrified silence over all the servants, making the hairs on the back of Havarian's neck stand to attention. Something was terribly, awfully wrong. He soon learned that someone had poisoned one of the horses. The horse that Renard had rescued from the marsh, perilously risking his own life in the process. The horse he had helped birth. The horse that had unwittingly killed the child. They knew what had been used from the sweet, sickly smell of the horse's breath. There was no remedy. It would be a long, slow death, and Renard had fed him herbs to kill the pain and to ease his passage into the next life, and had lain next to him all night, holding him as he died. He was still there, they said, though the mother of the child had already been savagely punished. She was dead. Having seen the extent of Jovan's cruelty when there was no real cause, Havarian did not want to hear how the woman had died. He did not want to know the details. He walked away and down towards the stable yard. The other horseboys were creeping around, shocked and silent, whispered to him that the horse had finally died only a few minutes ago, then parted to let Havarian through to see what was happening. The enormous, magnificent animal was quite still now, his face soft, as though he had died gently without suffering. Renard was lying across his neck still, weeping silently. He looked up as Havarian appeared in the doorway, blocking the light. His face was a picture of misery. He carried on looking up at the noble, asking wordlessly, was there something he needed? But Havarian put up his hands to say no, and started to back away. He hesitated, then said quietly, "I'm so sorry, Renard." Renard looked into his eyes for another moment, nodded, then lay his head down again and buried his face in the still warm hide. Cressa and Eli brought more news. Jovan had ordered Renard to butcher the animal for its meat, and had stopped angrily insisting only when Renard pointed out that, because of the poison, the meat was tainted, unfit and unsafe to eat. Then Jovan told him to skin the animal and preserve the hide. After that, the flesh was to be cut into pieces and taken to the fields to be burned. Renard obeyed without argument, though the kitchen slaves said he wept softly all the time he was cutting away the skin, and was bloody from head to foot, his hands shaking by the time he finished. When they took the horse-flesh to the burning pit, the slave said, they saw 3 skulls, one the child who had died under the horse's feet, the second his mother, and the third her friend, who was suspected of helping her. The kitchen staff muttered angrily about that. She had acted alone, they said. No one else would have been brave enough to help her hurt one of the Lord's horses. Even she had found the courage only because she was out of her mind with grief. The friend's death had been— The sentence was never finished, since the major domo walked in and asked Havarian's attendants if there was any way he could serve them. They smiled, thanked him for his civility, and wandered back to tell all to Havarian. When they were alone, Cressa said, "That horseboy will kill him one day. He'll drive him to it." Eli countered, "Anyone who weeps over a dead horse is not a natural killer." Havarian nodded. They were both right. Murder was not in the boy's nature, but anyone could be pushed beyond his limits.